First things first, it's ad time, and man, do I have an exciting announcement this week. Beyond Solitaire is proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations, and they have an awesome new initiative that just dropped. They are teaming up with Gen Con and with professional game designers to offer online courses about game design. Take one just for fun, or take 3 to get a certificate in applied game design from Central Michigan University and Gen Con. How cool is that? The first course, The Art of Game Crafting for your classroom, boardroom, or game night, will be led by Aloy Lasanta of Third Eye Games and will run from May 24th to June 30th. It's designed to help you create your own role-playing games tailored to your own needs at work, home, or on game night. Check out the link in the show notes to learn more and maybe register for the class. Let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod I have a very special guest, Dr. Charles Cartier. How you doing, Charles?
Doing well, Liz. How are you?
I'm doing all right. So you have a very interesting job at a place called CNA. Why don't you just give us a brief description of what that is? I know you can't tell us everything because you're a man of mystery.
Sure, happy to do so. So first off, CNA has underneath it the Center for Naval Analyses, and that's like a national lab for the Navy, the Department of the Navy, which includes the Navy and the Marine Corps. And so that's what a lot of our work focuses on. And particularly, we specialize in operations research and the field of operations research. Just a little bit of a 30-second blurb on our company. You know, we've been around for about 75 years, and we started off working on the U-boat fight and bringing scientists to kind of bring statistics to answer some of the problems with the U-boat fight during World War II. And so since then, we've developed, the field of operations research, helped to develop that. And now I'm here supporting them.
That's fantastic. So you didn't start as a professional wargamer, though. You are Dr. Charles Cartier because you have a PhD in, is it chemical engineering?
That's right. I got my PhD in 2017 from the Pennsylvania State University, and got my PhD in a variety of different topics, ranging from colloidal physics to microscale systems, microfluidic devices, and active matter. And so got some expertise there, and then totally shifted gears and got a job at CNA.
That's awesome. So how do you go from chemical engineering to pro wargaming? Was it a total career change, or is there some sort of natural flow that we can't see?
Yeah, no, I had an advisor that used to talk about our research, and he used to use this analogy that I love, where some people will throw a dart at a target and they'll like try to get it as close to a target that's already there. Other people just throw a dart at the wall and then paint the target around afterwards. And that very much feels like how I transitioned from my chemical engineering degree to CNA. In terms of uh, you know going back to 2017, I was wrapping up my PhD, got my doctorate, and knew I needed to get a job. And my wife had already gotten a job in DC, so I was looking for government jobs in particular. And one of the job applications that was floating around my department at the time was for CNA. It turned out that other members of my lab had been there in the past, so I was able to reach out to them, get kind of the scoop on what CNA is like, what they do. And it sounded interesting and, very different, but also very exciting, interesting problems. And so I figured, sure, that sounds like a cool place to be. Let's give it a shot. And initially, I thought, I was going to go into kind of data science or programming or something like that. And ended up sitting down with the head of the gaming team at the time, Ed McGrady, and it was an interesting interview because we spent, I think, a solid 30 minutes just chatting about board games we both like. And then at the end, I asked him, do you want to know anything about my background? And he was like, oh, I'm a chemical engineer too. I understand what you actually do. I just wanted to see what your knowledge of gaming was as well. And so little did I know at the time that he was going to lobby for me to join his team. And that's how I ended up on the gaming team.
Oh, that's awesome. So, I've talked to some professional wargamers on the channel and some professors who do gaming in the classroom. And sometimes people are hardcore gamers and sometimes people aren't. So in your case, it was an advantage. So tell me, what is your background as a hobby gamer? And is that common in your field or, maybe not?
I'd say it's more common than not, at least within our team. The One of the things we actually do as kind of internal training and development is we'll take some time to play board games, and we'll do it with kind of an analytic focus. So are there mechanics here that we could incorporate into war games that we're designing? What works well? What are the player dynamics that are evolving from this? What decisions do you have to make? How resource constrained are you? And so uh, there are elements of that we like to kind of piece apart and tear apart analytically. So that certainly helps there, but it's not a guaranteed yes or no for that, because a lot of I'll actually say probably the skill that I use most is uh, um, some of the stuff I did when I was planning my wedding. Just talking with a lot of people, figuring out what their inputs are, all their constraints were, and then kind of scoping what our wedding turned into, and a lot of the planning leading up to it into an event that was cohesive and had a start and an end and had a schedule in the middle. And so the that actually probably uh, all those soft skills associated with that come into play a whole lot more than the Settlers of Catan trading mechanic that may or may not be useful.
So, have you been playing board games your whole life? Are you a lifelong gamer?
Pretty much. I'm trying to think here. Yeah, growing up, my dad taught me chess when I was very little, and games like backgammon and Risk, and he crushed me at all of them, but did it in a very kind of kind way. Asking me, are you sure you want to do that? And then I do it anyway, and then I lose. But as I got older into high school, I found some friends who were like-minded, and we started pulling games off of my dad's shelf, stuff like Axis and Allies, different versions of Risk that were coming out. So the Lord of the Rings Risk was a fun one. But played a whole lot of Axis and Allies growing up, and then expanded out eventually into a lot of the common favorites at this point. Settlers of Catan and Splendor and things like that. So that was a lot of high school, and then grad school finally got into like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff too. So yeah, very consistently in the background.
Awesome. Do you play anything that could be termed by a hobbyist gamer as war games in your spare time, or do you prefer like what are considered more mainstream hobby games?
Yeah, good question. I think the closest that I've actively played start to finish is probably Axis and Allies, which if you actually pay really close attention to how the board is set up, it really does set you up for, if you're Japan, you're attacking Pearl Harbor. You're just going after it right away. If you're Germany, the clear strategy there is to crush Russia as soon as you can. Uh, if you're Russia, you're dumping all your money into foot soldiers. You don't have any money for tanks or anything else, and so it actually does kind of reflect some of the things that occurred in World War II. And so that's kind of neat. And then you can read in the back, some of the history and some of the extra mechanics you can pull in. The My dad used to collect actual formal war games, things like Squad Leader. I'm struggling to remember other names of them at this point. I don't think he had, one of the more famous ones like Harpoon 4, which was what Tom Clancy used to to model some of his books. The But I would pull a few of them off and like try to page through them, but they were just too dense for me when I was in high school. I was like, I don't care about this. I'm here for fun, and so yeah, never really got into them growing up.
So, in your job, you are creating games that I know that you can't talk too much about specific clients because of secrecy, everyone. But I know that you do some games for the Navy, that you do some for the Marines, and I guess my question then is, what kinds of games are you usually creating for them? Is it something that really feels like a board game, Or are you creating something that feels more like model you in with dice? What what kinds of games are we talking about when you're making war games that are paid for by a client in your situation?
Great question. So the usually they feel more like facilitated discussions. So what we refer to as tabletop exercises rather than formal war games. I have run and facilitated a few full on, force on force, with dice war games for actually training some of the CNA analysts as they get on board. And that's one of the more fun elements of my job. So happy to chat about that more. But in terms of what sponsors want, you get a whole range of problems. They can be very soft and squishy, really trying to just explore a concept or a topic that they don't fully understand. Maybe you're trying to get a lot of people together who have different pieces of a picture, but nobody can really see the full picture together. And for something that kind of soft and nebulous or unknown, really it's very valuable just to have everybody in the same place at the same time as a captive audience, and you get them to talk to each other. And then you've got note takers in the background that write everything down and try to pull that back together into a cohesive story. So that's kind of on the most nebulous side of things. And on the more rigorous side of things, so there's almost Axis and Allies style force on force games. That's We do something similar to that with the training war game that I alluded to. But in terms of actual events for sponsors, I think the most rigorous element that I've done is logistics war games. So there are, and this is one of the things that I really enjoy about war games. Actually, is you want to allow players to explore what decisions they can make. What's the right decision, what's the wrong decision, what do you want to prioritize? That's a big one. What are all the options? Explore the options in the option space. And as you're doing that, though, occasionally they will bump into a hard limit that is just physically not possible. You can't get your ship, across the Pacific Ocean in a day. There's a time constraint there. Your ship can only carry so many things. That's a capacity constraint there, and so logistics is kind of where I see a lot more rigor coming into limiting player decisions, and really where they've got resource constraints, they have to make decisions based on whatever the best option they have at the time is. And so there's kind of a nice blend between, you can actually see a very nice blend between modeling and player decisions and those sorts of dynamics within war games.
That's interesting. So on the squishier side of things, the more discussion based ones, I guess in what sense is that a game? And what kinds of rules can you typically put in place to make it feel gamey as opposed to we just made you all sit and talk to each other?
Yeah, it's so the discussions are often facilitated. One and typically I have been the facilitator in the past. Sometimes I design the game and hand the facilitation role off to somebody else. Um, and so there are a couple different ways to handle this, and really it's in the way you design the rules of the facilitation to make it more gamey. So one of the common terms or design techniques is a matrix style war game, and especially a kind of a free form matrix style war game is really just two sides present their argument, and you have somebody in the middle who's an adjudicator who says, "Okay, I heard one side, I heard the other side. Based on those two arguments, I think that this is what's going to happen next." And then you can hear rebuttals after that. If people really strongly disagree, so you have to be comfortable saying the wrong thing there and letting people correct you, and then discussion ensues. But ultimately, even if not everybody likes it, you all come up with a way ahead that we think is at least physically possible and reasonable, and you move forward. And oftentimes, what you want to do is chain events and turns together. So one set of discussions, okay, we decided this. Now, your next turn is going to build off of that. You're stuck with whatever you decided from the last turn. And so, if it turns out you have buyer's regret, too bad, let us know. But we're going to move forward and press forward with that. So that's where some kind of very simple game mechanics can add structure and put a little bit more weight on the decisions that players are making.
Oh, that's interesting. And then on the more gamey end, how complicated can you actually make these games? Like, my assumption is that a lot of times your clients may not be people who play board games all the time, who may not automatically like fall into the language of board games. And also, you might have specific points to get across. So, how gamey can they really be given the constraints that you have?
Sure thing. So I alluded to Harpoon 4 earlier, and there's if you go onto Steam, you can download a program called Command Modern Operations. I've never played it, but my understanding is that it is essentially a simulation of a battle. You don't even have to, you just type in the numbers, plug things in, and it just starts running. And if you forget to tell an aircraft to refuel at a certain point, that aircraft is just going to fall in the water. So it's so these so as you get into the simulation world, it can get very realistic, very detailed. Whether that's right or not is a different question. Is that really what would happen? Is up in the air. And so uh, uh, there is a tension, I think, within the wargaming community in terms of how useful is that, especially when you're trying to get players to just make decisions, and a decision may not be right. As you're starting to start simulating an event with a lot of humans making a whole lot of decisions individually, uh, are is a war game really predictive? And I would at least argue that the answer is no. A war game is not predictive of the future. What it is useful to do, though, is uh, pull out um, the key tensions between players and key challenges that players face where communication is going to fail, what the real priorities are when your push comes to shove and you have to make a decision. What are you going to pick first? A, B, or C? And so uh, so there has to be enough realism, I guess, to force players to get to that point, whatever decision is that you want them to make and collect data on afterwards. But not necessarily so much that they get bogged down in the details of how fast is a bullet going? Is it going to have this range or whatever? That's often more detailed than we need it to be. Um, hopefully that answered your question. Feel free to add on there.
No, actually, you said something I'm going to circle back to later. But first, how long do you typically have to develop a game? How much time are you given to create these experiences for your clients?
So that's another great question. It varies really, and often what we'll do is we'll work with a project with the sponsor early on to really get some high level scoping decisions made. So we need to ask them, what do you want to do with whatever this report is after the game, any of the game results? What do you want to do with that next? So those are the outcomes that we focus on internally. Then we look at, based on those outcomes, we design some objectives for the game itself. So if you want to, if the sponsor wants to do these outcomes, we need to do X, Y, and Z objectives. We need to hit those within this game, maybe plus some follow-on analysis or pre-game analysis. And that sets kind of a timeline for what we think we can do. But one of the key factors is if they have their own timelines and deadlines. They want this report to inform their next budget or their next development of a concept document or some other document or report or it needs to feed into a follow-on set of analysis that they have prepped or another experiment or exercise. Then there's kind of a hard deadline on that end that we need to also meet. And so there's but as a kind of rule of thumb, we try to plan for 3 months at least to prep the game. The game itself runs somewhere between 3 days and a week is what I've done. That's my experience. And then, we give ourselves 2 months to write up the report and another month to kind of go back and forth with the sponsor. So maybe 6-ish months total is you know, about the sweet spot. If we can have more time, we'll stretch it out more, maybe do more pregame analysis, more post-game analysis. You know, it also ends up being, resource constrained on our end at some point in terms of how much we can afford to do. So, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so you have roughly, let's just say, a 6 month gestation period. But you have all these different clients, and they all have their own needs and objectives. You are an expert in your research field of chemical engineering, but how often are you getting topics that maybe you don't necessarily know that much about to begin with? And then what do you do about that? What's the research process for a game like this in order to make sure that you're getting what needs to go into the game into the game?
All the time. I'd argue that the closest thing, if you really squint, to my own background is logistics, just because some of the math looks similar to what I did in a past life. But even that is really like, you got to push it to even see that one. So most of the time I'm going into a new project, not knowing a whole lot about the topic and the concerns. The and that's actually really exciting. It's really fun. Part of being a PhD, being a chemical engineer, at least, is a desire to continue learning throughout your life, right? So one of the elements I love about my job is I get to do that here. I get to learn new things pretty much every single project I pick up. The so it But that said, when you're designing a game, I shouldn't be the one talking as an expert about any topic, and I'm well aware of my restrictions on that. I can do some background reading, so that one of the tricks I do is I will say things intentionally that are incorrect, or at maybe half correct or 80% correct, to get people to correct me, and give the full, like, in detail answer. You also have to be comfortable using the Socratic method in these facilitations. Just ask reasonable questions to kind of peel the onion back a little bit more in terms of getting to more detailed layers to make sure that the data that you want at the end of this is useful for the final report. But the other element is, it shouldn't just be me alone doing this. I should be relying and pulling in, as I'm designing a game, other experts from within CNA and from outside CNA to talk in detail about certain subjects, and I can pivot to them. So whenever a question comes up, I'll maybe give a first pass at the answer or a suggested answer, but then I'll very quickly turn to our expert on logistics in the room, or our expert on medical systems or future systems, or whatever it is, the topic. So and ultimately that's really important too, I think, as a skill set, because as you do that, and as you learn the people in the room who are attending that you didn't pull in as an expert, but they have their own expertise set as well, you can turn to them, and then they start feeling heard within the room, and they get to say their piece about certain topics, and so everybody walks away feeling like they've contributed in some way too, and that's really valuable.
So you have a lot of expertise to pull on, and you're constantly doing a lot of research yourself. But that actually leads to my next question, and this is a question I always have about war games, right? And as you said, they're not predictive, right? But they exist to fulfill some sort of research objective, and or to inform some problem. And when you're researching, you have to discern what should go into a game and what shouldn't. So how are you the one who's primarily making those decisions, and how do you do it? Because I can see getting a whole lot of information, but then you also have to sift through it and pick what actually goes into the game.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So a lot of the initial design of the game, and really at least a month of the game, goes into just scoping discussions. Oftentimes, if we have more than 3 months to prepare, we will put more than a month into just discussing the scope of the game. What really, like, uh, do the sponsors want to get out of a project, and getting a very clear understanding of that. And that really helps us to identify things that, you know, are important to set up, put the backdrop of the game into context, set up the scenario, but are really just kind of nice wallpaper for what we're really trying to dive into and get at. So one of the things I've done a fair number of times at this point is medical logistics war games, and so I can use that as kind of an example here. In order to figure out, medical logistics, you care about patient movement. So you've got somebody who's been injured, a casualty, and you need to get them to some level of care based on how severe their injury is. You also need to get supplies to them. So, you've got folks who have been injured at the front lines, they're moving back, and you've got supply that's, in the rear somewhere that's moving forward, or maybe it's been prepositioned already. And so you've got these kind of two directions for supply going at one another. And so how do you get to that question? Well, first, there's a conflict. How do we get to the conflict? I don't know. But there are some ways to kind of make assumptions. There are some common conflicts that we'll just regularly go to. But then within that conflict, there's an engagement. So there's one little battle or skirmish or some sort of event has occurred within that conflict. And that's what generates the casualties. So you've got casualties in the past from the conflict. You've got the specific event that you're looking at in detail with kind of this backdrop noise of the rest of the conflict going on. And then you finally have your casualties at like time 0. And from there, that's really where the sponsors really have the questions. What do we do with the casualties? And what sort of supplies do we need to get to them? And so at that point, you can start asking, okay, what do those casualties look like? Do we need to model that? What sort of distribution of injuries are they going to have? Are they really severe? Are they, very mild? Who needs to go where at that point? And then how are they going to get there? Do we have the right vehicles? Do they have the right equipment to move the casualties where they need to go? And then ultimately, what supplies do they need once they get to wherever they need to be? Are the doctors available? Are they overworked? All sorts of questions. But you need to kind of ask these upfront questions about, like, what does the conflict look like? What does the engagement look like? What's realistic for those? And often those, as soon as you get through some of those initial questions and get some initial decisions on them, that is actually, in my mind at least, the first thing I kind of pitch in terms of the doing analysis. Because really, it helps players put themselves in the mindset. It helps them with the decisions that they're making. And that is important context for the decisions. But ultimately, we need to know, what are they doing with the patients, and what supplies do they need? And so you could almost just, pull those things off immediately, but then it's just kind of less fun. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of some of the scoping decisions that go in.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we spent some time talking about you developing expertise in order to make these games happen. I guess my other question is, are the people who are sponsoring the games, are they already experts in the areas they ask you to make a game about, or is that part of their learning process? What is the expectation for people coming to play your game in terms of their background knowledge and what they are bringing to the table?
Great question. And it's often it varies really, very, very drastically from game to game. So sometimes, uh, especially in the military, you'll have people who rotate in and out of jobs. So they're at a station for a couple years, they move out, and somebody else moves in. And so even if the last person had a lot of expertise, they knew exactly what the vision was for an event, you may get somebody new coming in who's taking it over that doesn't have the same background. And so they may be in an educational position. The previous sponsor may have been an expert in the field, so you can even have that within the same game. And so it is, it can vary a lot. In terms of the players that you're pulling in, often the game designer, one of their duties is to identify key decision makers for the game. We need somebody who's going to make this decision. We need somebody who can talk to this capability. Going back to the medical example, maybe you need somebody to make a decision about whether aircraft are going to be used to move medical personnel or move other forces forward or other supplies forward that aren't medical. So if you identify that that's critical for the game, you need somebody in the room to be able to talk to that decision, even if they may not have ever made that decision in real life before, and that's okay. But at least talk to all the pros and cons and constraints and understand the decision space well enough to speak to it honestly, or legitimately rather. Um, let's see. So that's uh, kind of, so you'll identify key participants, and I think getting the right kind of key players in the room is really critical. And then after that, um, you kind of open the net in terms of who else is interested, and people will kind of self-identify themselves as, oh, that's related to some work that I'm doing. I want to be at this event as well. Can I get an invite? How do I show up? All of that. Um, so you'll have some people who are trying to get in. You have some people that you'll be reaching out to invite to pull in to make sure that you've got the right expertise in the room, and from there, the chaos ensues. But it's always very fun, and you get to meet a lot of interesting people, and with all sorts of backgrounds.
That really does sound fun. So what I'm getting is that there's a level of research and focus that goes into these games that's consistent. You need objectives. You're thinking about how to get the objectives. You're looking at and consulting experts. You're trying to bring key players into the room. But at the same time, there's also a lot of variation that can happen here, clearly. And you mentioned earlier that war games are not predictive. And it also seems that clearly, this research model, right, is not perfect. It's not going to catch everything. So with all those things being the case, what is the value of what you do?
That's a great question. So one uh, one thing that war games are very good at are identifying gaps. Our lead war game designer actually just recently wrote an article about how it's good if you don't win a war game. You go in thinking that the blue team's going to beat the red team. But that's okay if that doesn't happen. And actually, that helps illustrate problem areas that need to be fixed. And so maybe you're not identifying what the solutions are. That's not the job of the war game. What we can do sometimes, and what I try to do, because I really enjoy modeling and I enjoy kind of pulling as much scientific rigor into events as possible, is I'll put some time and some effort aside for after the game to do some post game modeling, some post game research, just to kind of do some fact checking of what players were saying. Not that I think they're not speaking honestly, but just making sure that they're uh, uh, just making sure that there's something additional external evidence to back up what was said within the game. You also identify a lot of open questions for further study, and that's where you start looking at what we refer to as the cycle of research. So ultimately, a war game shouldn't be an input into the final answer. A war game is an input into maybe a follow-on study that is very exclusively about modeling and simulation. And that's where you get really the rigorous modeling and simulation that happens. Or maybe you want to test it out in an exercise with a formal kind of experimental procedure such that you can get statistical significance on whatever it is you're trying to do. So the war game is not the last stage in the event. Often it is the very first stage in discovery, kind of gathering information, gathering people with a whole lot of different backgrounds to identify a set of common problems or common themes across a number of different organizations that really merit further study. So that's, I think, where the sweet spot is for war games.
Nice. All right. So what I'm understanding from this is that war games are supposed to help ask questions almost more than answer them definitively. And the other thing that's interesting about this is that if you're going to continue doing research projects, and also really only limited people can play a game, you mentioned earlier that sometimes games can be used to help develop budgets, to help make plans. There are people taking a bunch of notes in the back during these. So how does data collection occur during these war games for you to disseminate either to people who've been in the session and need a refresher, or people who weren't there but need the blow by blow of what happened.
Sure. So the so actually, interestingly, one of the first outcomes of the game that happens immediately is the experiences that people take with them back to their own commands. So everybody's going to walk away with something new that they've learned. At least, hopefully, that's my desire. Is they're all walking away with something new that they've learned out of one of these events that they're taking back, and have new thoughts to kind of consider and integrate into their own projects and decisions that they're making. But in terms of what we do as the next step is uh, we have data coming in from a number of different sources. So one is the actual events within the game. What decisions do players make? And that's typically just recorded by note takers within the room. And they're uh, doing something close to taking a transcription of what's happening. At least that's what I asked them to do. But it's wrong to think of them as just kind of like a secretarial position. Really, I'm picking people who are much smarter than me on a given topic, and I'm telling them take notes on this topic. Uh, and because I'm going to ask you to like write a report on it afterwards, and you have the expertise in the background to actually identify key things that are being said. Um, the There are a couple other things that you can do. So there's just what people say, but there are some interesting things you can do in the context of a war game if you are designing it well for one of these things. One is getting prioritized decisions. So not just what people say, but what they do and what that implies about what their actual revealed priorities are, not just what their the official stated priorities are. When everything's important, nothing is, and so the getting people to really think, of these many important things, which ones are we actually going to do first, and then if you have time, go back and do the other ones. So that's one source of information that comes out. Another that I think is really interesting and is very challenging to get at is when people decide not to do things. So not just they said, here's the final decision, but how they got there. They actually went down this rabbit hole and they said no to that. Getting a concrete no can be as important as getting, a yes to something else. It's very challenging to get people to say no to things. And then the last one is uh, understanding in full the parameter space, if you can capture that in some way. And usually I use flowcharts to do this. But if you can capture the full decision space of a problem set, here's in the command and control process for casualties and medical logistics, you start with the casualties, and then somebody reports that up, and then and you can just kind of list out, here's what players said they would do in the game. Does that match up with what they actually say they're going to do in current doctrine and literature and publications that are available? If it doesn't, maybe you should go back and look at that. So those are some of the things that you can do in terms of data, and then if you can, in parallel to all of that, do some modeling, do some background research, pull in additional sources, so that you're not relying on a single source of information that is often very player dependent. If we're being honest, it's dependent on subjective decisions. So the yeah.
It sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that making a war game is in some sense subjective because you're choosing what goes in. And then getting data from it is also somewhat of a subjective undertaking because you can write down literally what happened, but if you want to actually get anything out of the notes, you need somebody who is actually an expert and who knows what to look for and potential holes and pitfalls. So we are talking, correct, about sort of interpretive data as opposed to objective, like here are your results that you can then go just apply to whatever happens next.
So it depends. Usually, I think the answer is often yes, or at least very close to that answer. There are some other shades that come into this, so you can start pulling in qualitative methods to analyze the notes. So if it's me analyzing the notes and I'm not an expert in something, one of the first things I'll do is just I'll start, you know, doing counts of, you know, here's how many times, you know, or here's the number of turns that this particular problem came up. You know, that's a very simple metric that you can get out, and all of a sudden you have a number rather than a just kind of a broad trust me, you know, this is important. So that I don't put a lot of weight on that number because ultimately it is kind of an artificial scenario, but it does help me make sure that post game I'm not misrepresenting the players. You know, they did really bring this particular problem up 10 times. This other problem only came up once. So problem that only came up once may be way more important than problem that came up in 10 times though. So there's also there's still kind of a subjective balancing that you got to do to those. So it is very exploratory. It is very scoping focused. That said, on the other end of things, if you're looking at jumping back to logistics games just because I know them, if you start your vignette, you know, your event where you're modeling casualties with, you know, a model that actually comes up with here's the statistics for the damage of an expected strike. And then from there, we, you know, have medical data that actually tells us what casualties are going to do in terms of how well those survive in given environments over time. Um, you can you it's probably inappropriate, and it oftentimes is inappropriate to give players like ultra detailed numbers like that. But post game, you can take a modeled event that creates a lot of damage and casualties, follow that with modeling of what happens to the casualties, and then finally you can use an estimate from the players in the game of here's how many supplies they think each patient would need of this given condition, and you've got a decision paired with a model, and you can ultimately use that to say, all right, if that's your decision, you need X many supplies ready to go should this particular thing happen. And it's an open question whether that particular thing will happen still. But if you do that maybe over a large variety of different events, so you aren't focused on one particular vignette, but you focus on 10, and you're looking at small scale, you're looking at big scale, you're looking at a large distribution, large change in scope between different events, you can kind of find, where the middle ground is. If you're at this amount, you'll cover these vignettes over here. You won't cover these really big bad ones over here, that sort of thing. So you can get into the numbers still, but it is very challenging to do, and it requires a lot of prep work in terms of all the modeling that goes into the event pre-game, making sure that's presented to the players accurately, and then post-game afterwards. So it's possible, but it has to be handled with care, I guess is how I'll say that.
Got it. All right, this is super interesting. But I want to just sort of start winding down and ask how. So, if somebody's interested in becoming a professional wargamer and doing what you do, what advice would you give?
That's a great question because I like I said at the beginning, um, I've kind of painted a target around myself in terms of, oh yes, I've come here and I've done this, I have experience with it. But if you had looked at me back at and asked me back in 2017 when I was getting PhD if I was going to go and make war games, I would have said absolutely not. I had no anticipation that that would ever happen. Um, so I did kind of fall into it, and so it's challenging because of that to give good advice. The I suppose if you do have the opportunity to attend a war game, or participate in one in some way, or support one, there are ways to build up to actually designing and facilitating games. You don't start there. You start being one of the note takers in the room. It's okay to not be a subject matter expert and just be kind of the person who's taking notes as fast as you can, and you hope that somebody else will pick up from there and tell you, okay, this is what actually matters and won't. So that's totally fine to do. There are often elements of a game that you can try to design. Um, uh, that the lead designer will give you. So components that you contribute to. Ultimately, you need to be in a organization that is doing this anyway. If you're, uh, yeah, so the in terms of selling yourself and saying, I, I I assume you'd be doing it because you have that background already as maybe a board game designer or something like that. You've done that for years, and now you want to um, come into the world of professional war games, or maybe you're a historian. You've looked at historic battles for a while, and now you want to look at future battles instead, and how those may or may not play out. The uh, you can take a few different approaches. One is kind of the graphic design approach. So I don't do a lot of the graphics for games, but there is this kind of element of games that requires players to interact with the game, and you want them to do that. And for them to really get immersed in an event, into a game, the materials need to look clean and sharp and kind of enticing. It's not analytic, but it's important. So yeah, that's kind of me spitballing for a little bit. I don't know if that's helpful or not. Feel free to ask questions on any of that, though.
Now, every experience is different. So, if people do actually have questions for you, is there a place that you can be reached online, or are you sort of a non-social media man of mystery type?
The Yeah, so good question. I think if anybody has interest, I'd say if they reach out to you first and you can pass questions on to me, the yeah, we'll leave it there.
Yes. So, unlike people who are wise with their time, I have social media everywhere, and you can find me all over the internet as Beyond Solitaire. Thank you so much for coming on, Charles. This is super interesting, and I wish you all the best in this career. This is so cool.
Thanks. Really appreciate you having me here. This was fantastic. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for listening, everybody, or watching. Do like, subscribe, comment, and most of all, happy gaming.